Uh, what I suggest, Eric, is can you mute everyone and then I'll unmute myself? Just
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Thank you. I am so delighted to be here, as well as to be a participant in so much of the rich sharing that has been going on, and seeing how each workshop just feeds the next. So the morning started with Alita, what a gift that was, and then going through Allison, and hopefully I'll be able to help build and continue to show you yet another way into to healing story, and being present for another in their stories that may be stuck or painful. And as I say, a healing listener in that way, or a healing teller, how to help them move through that to a more fulfilling or more satisfying story that holds more of them to be able to live in. So to build on Eric's introduction to me, I am a psychologist. About 25 years ago, I discovered not only story, but the idea of that story could be healing, which just blew my mind, which sounds sort of crazy as a psychologist, because what I was doing was actually listening to people's stories all day long, and in many ways was working as a healing storyteller, but had never thought of myself in that way. So it was an intentional shift for me to think of it in terms of somebody being in a story and being stuck in a story that wasn't comfortable, a character in a story they didn't want to be in. And therefore the work is how to shift them into a story that actually would hold more potential for them to lead a fuller, more satisfying life. So my journey in exploring healing story brought me first off with a wonderful opportunity to work with the incarcerated, which I began that work in 2004. And that's really where I began to, with their gift of being open, available, and wanting to do the work, to learn about story listening, storytelling as a healing method or mode. That work, and it began with City Mission Boston. I want to give credence to the organization that had the foresight to bring in a storyteller to work with their guests and clients. They also serve the homeless, and my work expanded to be working with homeless populations, both in healing in shelters and warming centers, but also on the street. The work then expanded to be with youth at risk, with women at risk, with those who had experienced trauma. So it has been almost 20 years that I've been learning through the gifts of working with people who are in very painful stories of how to shift and work through that. So I wanted to say why I do this. It is the most incredibly privileged and satisfying work to see somebody who is stuck in a very painful story shift from that place of being a victim or powerless to, in fact, not only finding their voice, but finding healing through that process of shifting their relationship to their story, and not only changing their lives, but then becoming advocates to change others. That, in fact, that idea that not only do I exist, but I matter, and I now have the power to help other people move to that place. And with that, I want to share a story of one of the people I work with in a homeless shelter. Her name is Brenda, and she very kindly has given me permission to share her story. But we were, Brenda was part of a women's storytelling group at a day shelter for women in Boston. And she, in some ways, was sort of invisible when she first came, had her hair pulled very tightly back into a bun, wore gray sweatsuits every day, was very, very quiet. And yet when she was encouraged to speak and to tell her story a little bit, she had a very powerful story of having been a single mother who was not, became pregnant before, while she was in high school, so never went to college. Raised two daughters alone down in the South, and her oldest daughter was accepted to college in Boston, which was just such a pride for her. Her daughter came up to Boston and became pregnant her freshman year and said, "I'm going to drop out." And Brenda said, "No, you're not." And she left her job down in Alabama and moved to Boston and got various jobs to try and both support her daughter by taking care of the baby during the day and working at night to financially keep them both afloat. In one of her positions, because she was showing up, just trying to bring her best, but always tired, exhausted, was continually criticized by a supervisor. And this is, in fact, a story of racial injustice. Brenda is Black, her supervisor was white. She was continually accused of being lazy, and one day called a lazy and the N word. This was so traumatic to Brenda that she started to shut down, started in fact do less and less at work because she said, spending more time in the bathroom just because she felt so sick most of the time and scared, to the point where she was finally fired, which didn't have the confidence to go for another job, ended up at this point losing her apartment and ending up on the street. Fortunately, by this point, her daughter had graduated from college and was launched, and her daughter ironically moved back to Alabama to take a job, and Brenda was stuck in Boston homeless and couldn't even find the money to leave. As part of this group, what we do is encourage the storytellers to step into their story. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this and how it works, to walk around it, to challenge various parts of the meaning that they're making of their stories, to see themselves in different perspectives and lights. And then the third part is to find the courage to actually tell their story to another, that another might understand both them, but the circumstance better, clearer, and have their own story changed because of it. And Brenda said, I don't think I could ever do that. So I continued to encourage her. It was probably a year and a half of being in this group that finally there was a chance for her to tell at a high school. And she finally said, maybe I will. The following week, when and I must say she went and she did it, and I was not there that day, but I saw the following week when we had our class that somebody walked in and said hi, and I didn't recognize who it was, and I looked at her and she said, you don't know who I am. And in fact, the Brenda I had seen the week before was not the Brenda who had re-entered. She was wearing a beautiful, bright shirt. Her hair was more relaxed and down, and she was wearing makeup and carrying herself with a whole different way of being. And I said, what happened? And she said, I was heard. I was appreciated. The kids came up afterwards and told me that I had changed them. And I realized I count, I matter. My story is important to somebody. I want to do this more. We have created a public voice speakers bureau for people whose voices had normally been silenced or not appreciated to come and share their stories broadly in the community. And Brenda became one of our strongest story speakers in the Public Voice Project. So transformation happening at work. So to begin, I want to put it back to you, because I think it would be helpful to have some common nomenclature, because we talk so freely about what healing is, what story is, but to have an understanding and thoughtfulness, awareness within ourselves, what does that mean? But beforehand, I want to take one step even further back before we can talk about healing, is what is broken. So I put out to us now, and I invite you to use the chat to think about that word disease or dis-ease. What is disease? What does that mean to you? What other words come to you that evoke broken? And let's just see if we can fill up the chat to understand what this might be or look like, to understand what it is we are trying to heal. So beautiful. I see them start to fill out imbalance, woundedness, a sense of hopelessness, without life, unhappy, yes, dissociation, no comfort, deep pain, disaster, stuck, stagnant, lost, not in harmony, disconnected, so important, deep fear, sense of drowning, not able to digest or accept, self-hatred, not knowing how to move forward. very powerful, uneasy, uncomfortable in your own skin, feeling useless. Yes, darkness, disrupted, contaminated, guilty, corrupted, powerful, frozen in time, corrupted, yes, burnout, lost, yes. Never the same, never the same. Can't see yourself anymore in pain. We all have felt so many of these things. We've all had that experience of disease. So now let's flip it. What does healing mean, look like, feel like to you? What are words that come to you for that? Hope, hope, hope. Peace, freedom, repair, joy, self-acceptance, blooming, sunshine, strength, wholeness, recoup, listened, abundance, love, love. Yes. Thank you. Keep it coming. Light, loved, voice, therapy, personal authority, companionship, blissful, freedom, put back together, beautiful, comfort, strength, heard, love and care, wholeness, heroism. Yes. Fly, to be able to fly, confident, energized, resonating, resonant, self-accepting, release. So for the fun of it, I'm going to share my screen and bring you in. Let's go right to the top here. And let me put it on the right mode to take you through. So I want to take you quickly. There's Brenda telling her story in the public voice. So proud to be there. But I have these words that I asked the same question in a group of people whose lives were challenged, indeed threatened with cancer, and were in the midst of chemotherapy in a cancer support group that I was working with. So you see how many of the same words come up for us who are healthy in our bodies, but think what disease is. And these are people whose bodies were indeed challenged with life-threatening illness. And similarly, what is healing? So many of the same words: laughter, light, awakened, connectedness, made whole, rejuvenated. So I want to talk just for a moment about this idea of disease and words. So there's an article written, which I'm happy to share the link to people, written by a doctor who talks about the difference between disease, illness, and sickness. And what she said is that disease is actually the organic issue that is happening physically in a body. But illness is something different. Illness is the patient's relationship or story to that disease. How the patient understands having this disease. What's the story they hold about its impact on their life? And in fact, sickness is what other people's stories are about the patient having this disease. So the disease itself is the work of doctors and curing. But illness and sickness have to do with the stories of the impact of that disease on us. And that is the work of healing. And that's the work, I believe, of storytellers. And again, the disease does not have to be something organic. It can be anytime those moments of brokenness, of disconnectedness, of not feeling whole, of feeling stuck are there. And the work of healing is looking at what is our story about that, or what is other people's stories about us in that, because other people's powerful voices and stories impact us and how we stand in our own story. And there's where it's also important to understand and know the context of that. So the next question is, all right, so we know what perhaps disease or brokenness is. We know what healing is. We talk about healing stories. So what is story? And this I know everybody here knows very well, but just to review, stories are about change. They're about what used to be, what happened, and what things are like now. And so they're organic and they're changing all the time. Um,
Lani,
yes?
excuse me, but I'm not sure we've mentioned the title of your workshop. The title is Storytelling for Connection, Insight, and Transformation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's on that first slide, and I hope that that's why people are here, is to hear just that. But the idea of this is that our stories are something that are in us, are deeply a part of us, but they are in some ways overlaid. And it makes me think of the story, and many of you here in India will know it, of the golden Buddha that was treasured, and in fear of the marauding invaders was covered in mud to protect it, its treasure, and was covered for so long that people forgot the golden Buddha that was beneath the mud. And it took centuries for somebody to see a crack in that mud that had some gold shining behind it, and to begin to dig a little bit through the mud to find the gold beneath. And that's the metaphor that I like to think of who we are as healing storytellers. We're always trying to sift behind that mud, which I believe are our broken stories, to find the healthy, strong, competent person beneath. Because my belief is that we are not broken, our stories are broken. And it's the stories that need healing to reveal to us who is beneath those broken stories. So I refer to that as a thin story. A broken story is a thin story. And the goal is to help us move out of a thin story that's a broken story. It doesn't hold enough of who we truly are, our golden Buddha inside. It doesn't hold our strength, our abilities, our capabilities, our potential. And we believe it, and therefore we stay smaller than we are. And the goal is not to change that story, it's to thicken that story, because that story often holds facts within it. We can't change the facts, but we can change the meaning of those facts as a way of expanding our story and the meaning we make of it, so that that meaning holds more of us in it. It brings our golden selves to that. So just quickly, I want to talk about thin stories and how they happen. This is the brain on story. All of those dots are experienced moments. But what the brain does is it takes those experiences, which I think of as facts, as true things that happened, and it ties it together in meaningful making ways, which is in fact our memory. It's our remembered experience. And the brain does this as a survival mechanism. It wants to remember so that anything that comes through us now as a new experience gets filtered through all the experiences we have had to determine instantly whether what we're stepping into is safe or not. And so in that moment, the brain is remembering the experiences of the past to say, yes, this is okay, keep going, opening yourself, it's all right to be fully present and vulnerable, or it's saying, no, danger, step back, this is not okay and this is not safe. And it makes those decisions based on previous memories of previous experiences. Our memories become our truth. They are the way we've made meaning of what is true. We don't live in the world of true, we live in the world of truth. And that is unique and singular to every one of us. For any of you who have ever had siblings and sat at the same dinner table, you know you are all having a different experience in that moment and will remember it differently because you are different. And so this experience is being filtered through who you uniquely are, and you are making your own meaning of it. So what one person in the same experience may laugh at, another person may cry at. It's the same external true, but your truth leads you to respond differently. And that's organic and changing because we're making meaning of it all the time. So although they say you can't go back and change the past, you can only have authorship over the future, I would differ and say you can't change the facts of the past, but you can change the truth of the past. And that's part of what healing is. It's allowing ourselves to revisit the meaning we've made at different points in our past where we have been stuck, and allowing that thin story that we've made of that. And a thin story often results in I can't, I'm not good, I'm less than, and expand the meaning of that to appreciate actually that golden self that's in there of who I am and what I can do. Claiming, there's a prompt that I use when we get towards the ends of workshops that is, I am, I can, I will. And that's claiming that healing side, that those words you used of voice, of agency, of ability to have control over where I'm moving in my future. So this is a thin story of tying things together that may result in I can't. And part of the goal, we're going to talk about story expanders. That's the how we're moving from thin to thick, is the way that we tie that thin story to other things, gain perspective, so that that thin story actually is increasingly thicker. And so that process of healing is not about arriving somewhere. It's about an ongoing process, because we will always have thin stories. And it's about continually raising that to awareness and finding means, like the work that Allison was doing, that Alita was doing, to step into those thin stories and walk around them and find different ways to bring ourselves to them such that we can thicken them so that we actually can live in them better, fuller, differently. So there are many people doing this work. I want to share what comes out of the therapeutic world of trauma and narrative healing. What that looks like is that when people have a stuck or painful story, they actually are feeling that shame that leads them to feel isolated or silenced. And it's like Brenda saying, I'm never going to share this story with anybody. I'm so ashamed of who I am. And so the first thing that one has to do is create a trusting enough and safe enough environment that they're willing to step in and begin to share that with either one other or with others. And that's this realm of remembering and forgetting, of walking around, of working with it, whether it be through fairy tales or some of the story expanders I'm going to talk about, of how we can begin to play with it with a therapeutic realm, till we can move to that third area, which is not where it's done. And I heard someone at the end of Allison saying, my ending doesn't still fit or feel right. We're continually working it, growing it, stepping into it with more and more of our potential. But there is some sense of resolution where I can look back and say, yes, I have moved here to a new place where I have more agency, more ability to move and to grow, which often happens through taking our story and, in fact, telling it to another who can witness us in that, so that we have more and more practice of standing in that new story, as opposed to getting caught and going back to where we were. So I often use the work of the reintegration is going back into our old world with the new story and living in that. That is not unlike the arc of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, which I know people have mentioned earlier in this and in other workshops. And it's a framework that I use often of, let me just bring up that framework, where it's the call to adventure that brings us into this middle place where there's challenges and turning points. I'm going to take you actually to one more, because it's a template that I use with people, where it's where I was, what did I want, why was it important? And in that middle place of the road of challenges and trials where we're at, the work of those boxes is what was coming at me from the outside in terms of constraints, resistors, what was coming at me from the inside in terms of constraints and resistors, who were the resources and helpers outside, and what were the internal strengths and abilities that I used to get there. So it's this combination of working about, I am not alone. There are others who walk this path with me, but I also have internal strengths and capabilities, and to claim them, to see those, first of all, to recognize them, to claim them, and to celebrate them as part of our transformation. So for Brenda's story, it went from I am a failure to I am a strong woman who showed up for my child, who faced social inequities and racism and found my way back, and am continuing to stand strong and grow in who I am. And that's the story she told. It has elements of the facts of the moments where she tripped, but those became moments where, in fact, she learned more about what was in her and what she could do that led to this stronger story about herself and who she is. So they always say a journey is called, let me see where I am, is that because you cannot know what you will do with what you find or what you find will do to you. So it's about this exploration, this piece. So I want to just stop share for a moment because I've talked a lot and we are going to do some exercises, but I just want to check in and see if there's thoughts or questions that would be helpful for anybody.
So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, unmute yourself, speak, and then please mute yourself again.
So this is very, very beautiful. The fact that, I was reading a book called Breaking Night, written by Liz Murray, and she said something very powerful, that children grow into the kind of conversations that they have around them. And that's exactly about what you're saying, that, restructuring your past and seeing the best in it and seeing your internal strength, and, being able to move forward through that. I have one question which I think you're very qualified to answer, which I have had in this process, is that when we are dealing with somebody who is broken or who is devastated, mm, they are in many ways, they have that sense of being that the victim. And yet there are cases, and many cases in fact, where the victim has also been has not been a perpetrator or hurt other people. So when in the patient's progress, could you probably also bring on that self awareness? See, some people come in and they're very harsh or they're very brash, and they don't understand that that is probably causing other people to step away. So this sort of self awareness, where would you bring into their journey or their process, or is this part of what you do at all?
Mm. So it's so individually dependent, and it is part of that process throughout. So the beginning piece is again, I would say, I don't see the person as broken. I'm continually looking for that golden self and realize that they are in this stuck in a broken story that is bringing themselves pain. And that we need to acknowledge that, we need to hear that. And some of the danger is by how we listen so that we don't reinforce the broken story or re-traumatize them through the telling of the story. So it's a delicate balance of getting the story heard and out in a safe way that allows that person to then begin to reflect and work on it. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about next. So you've set me up beautifully of how does one move from not just hearing this story, but in fact guiding them through that that reflective process of moving from that thin story that they're stuck into something that is thicker and can hold more of them. So we're going to talk more about that now.
Vidya? Vidya, did you want to say something? Or Vidhi?
Yeah, hi. I think it's been really enchanting till now what you have shared. You talked something about ritual injustice, and it just made me think of King Atlas in Greek mythology. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. So he's holding like a whole world on his head. So what happens during such times, since so some people go into the blaming mode and they become very angry with the world and how things are and how social systems, and so how do you shift from that King Atlas mode to being more centered. I mean, does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, it does. And again, these are, hold that idea and let's get to where I'm going to share about how to help somebody step into a story that's thin and begin to thicken it. And part of that is very much the shift from victim to hero of your story. Because it is that meaning that we make of the story and who we are in it that is part of what brings us suffering and pain. And that shift from, I can't do it, it's all being done to me, I have no power to change it, that leads somebody, I think, smaller than they are. And so how do we help them move to that, to agency, to strength, to feeling like they have the competence to move forward? And that's part of the work.
Lani, can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Okay, so I personally feel that till now in a lifetime, you face many challenges and you're heartbroken many times. Also, through your lifetime, you tend to overcome those challenges and move on. But that gives a pain in the heart and it remains in the heart. So, should we still narrate the story to someone, like tell it out to someone, or should we just move on?
So the painful story itself shifts so that what we're telling when we have done the work is no longer bringing us pain. It's part of the facts of how we got to our new place. So it becomes not that old story that's thin. It's a thicker story that has the elements of the thin story in the middle of it, but it's not just the thin story. That's the difference. When we tell the thin story, we are still in pain and the victim in it. When we tell the thicker story, the storyline in the center is the same, but the meaning and the abilities within it are totally different. And that's when we have the ability to actually impact another who's caught in a similar thin story and can help them see their own way to expand it and move forward. And that's when we move from being what I call a wounded teller to a healing teller. And that's part of the process of what we're working on. And so there's different ways of entering this work. Many of you are what I call healing storytellers, and you're creating stories for the means of helping a wounded listener expand their perspective of the world such that there is healing in that engagement, in that interaction, that relationship, that exchange of story, and that space between you. There are also people who are walking with wounded stories and in need of a healing listener. And that is also part of the work, is when someone brings to you a thin story, what is our job as healers, as healing tellers? How do we engage in that relationship such that we help them expand that story so that it is no longer re-wounding every time they tell it, but can move from being a wounded story into a healing story? And so sometimes in those interactions with somebody who is wounded, we need to bring a story and be a healing teller in that moment. But sometimes we actually need to be a healing listener and draw them out and work with them in their story in ways that they can move from wounded teller to healing teller themselves.
Lani, Mayor and Kartik have raised their hand. Do you want to take two more participants, or do you want to go on? What do you want to do?
Why don't we take two more quickly, and then, because sometimes I'll end up answering it later in the material, but let's hear what they have to say.
Yes, go ahead, Mayor. You have to turn your mic on, yeah.
Yeah, hi Lani. Can
Hello.
you hear me? Am I
Yeah.
audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really loved, the interpretation and the profound things that you shared. But, what I felt was this story you shared about the person. Sorry, I can't recollect her name. Can
Brenda.
we say that she's overcome her thin story? Because, Brenda, or by one experience of sharing it in a, safe space, can we assume that any other trigger later on in her life will not cause the same pain or will not trigger the same thin story? because at the end of the day, life is not linear. There are many thin stories that we weave around constantly. So maybe if one part of that story is healed, probably the other part is still needs to be mended. That's what I felt.
So I'm going to go to the second question after in a minute, but you're going right where I was going next. So I just want to speak to that for a moment.
Sure.
I'm telling you a short story
Okay.
about my own life. So this is a story I used to show or explicate the steps. So when I was 8 years old, I was in church on Christmas Eve with my mother and my father and my 3 siblings. And I was so excited because it was Christmas and all of the potential of what's there. So it was a series of lessons and carols. And with each Christmas carol that I sang, I got more excited and I sang louder and bigger until the last Christmas carol that we were singing, my father put his hand over my mouth to quiet me. And I sat down and I was ashamed that I had been so loud and big. And what that happened, that became a thin story in my life, that whenever I started to get excited about something, my father's hand would come into my mind and I'd think, oh, take it down, calm down, be quiet. And so what happens when a thin story is in one's mind or brain, the amygdala is always scanning for moments that are like that to protect you from that same moment of shame or mistake or embarrassment. Not that it was a mistake, but we perceive it as such. So we are looking for it, which means the thin story is always being reinforced. And even when someone tries to share with you a different experience, like someone saying to me when I was in college, you should join the choir, you have a lovely voice. I was like, no way. And I couldn't even hear that because it just brought anxiety to me. So I'm going to skip to the end, and then later I'm going to bring you back to the middle of what happened between 8 years old and 58 years old. 50 years later, I'm walking into church with my husband and my own 4 kids, late as usual, running down the aisle. They're already singing the opening hymn, and it's a hymn that I know and I love. So I just start singing, and we're standing in the pew. My husband opens the hymnal and he starts, and then he becomes aware that I'm not on the same verse as everybody else, and I'm singing all different words loudly. And so he looks at me and he goes, just that movement of his hand in church singing, I was 8 years old again. I sat down and the tears started flowing and I felt shame. And I all of a sudden was back in my thin story of how dare I? And in that, what I threw away was, how dare I be a psychologist? How dare I think I'm a healer when I am so broken? How dare I be a mother? How dare I be a teacher? How dare I be married to this jerk? I threw it all out the window. The difference is when it happened at 8, that story became thinner and deeper in me for years until I did the work. When that story was re-triggered at 58, my thick story collapsed into a thin story and I was 8, but it took me 10 minutes to reinflate it because I had done my work and I knew how to challenge the meaning in that moment with a pause and a reflection and doing my own inner story work to get back so that by the time the next hymn came, I could stand and sing again. So they say where your wound is, you're stronger. I don't believe that. We're always vulnerable in places where we've been wounded. The difference is the recovery time and how we're able to manage the rewounding when a similar story comes back and re-traumatizes ourselves. So I want to see.
Excellent.
Thank you so
Kartik.
much for that.
You're welcome. If there's one other question, and then I'll get back in because I want to make sure we also have time for you to do a little piece of work yourselves.
Kartik, go ahead.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Lani. So my question is direct question related to the story of a person you shared about Brendan, right? Thank you for sharing that story. So there are many people who had such kind of trauma stories. The experiences only they have it, and they never shared with anyone. That was a scary story, right? Which they don't want to share with anyone. So going with the story concept, what you shared. So there was a Brendan with a story, but she didn't share. At the end, she shared it, right? She transformed herself.
Mhm.
But as like Brendan, many others, the middle part of it, right? The breaking point of something going on in the process, right,
Mhm.
Brendan? So what is that in that short frame of what is that striking point? There will be some kind of a breaking point the first time she opened up, right? What was that the process in place? Thank you.
Yes. This is perfect because that's right where I was going next. So, uh, as you recall from the earlier arc that I showed that comes out of narrative healing, when we have a painful story or a thin story, we often stay in that place of silence because there is shame. And as long as we keep that story just within our heads, we stay stuck and it stays thin. It has to come out into the light in order for us to be able to expand it and work on it. And that is usually done in relationship. It's hard to do it yourself. It can be, but relationship is having a healing listener to help you walk around it differently is central to that story. And so Brenda first had the courage to come to group. She didn't speak for several weeks, but when she did and started to share her story in little bits, there were many things that we did in the context of group. So I'm going to bring my share screen back up. And there's Brenda. Let me bring us down a little further. So I want to share with you is it in the large screen? It's not going to me to let me just see. That's me at 8. That's my story. So there are several steps in this process. So the first is just to pause, to reflect, to say, what is the meaning of this story to you? And that's part of, Alita was talking about this morning. So if I were to do this work and to think about it, what's the meaning that I am making of this story? And it's usually of what I was making is I should not sing or share out loud. And what happens is you start to generalize that is not, I shouldn't just sing so loud in church, is I can be embarrassing anytime I get passionate. So in college, I didn't raise my hand. And even though professors would read my papers and say, you have interesting ideas, I wish you'd speak up more in class, that was way too dangerous for me because I could become an embarrassment. So you start to generalize it and see the thin meaning we're making of one moment and how it has become a thin guiding story in us that's keeping us smaller than we are. So what's the meaning I'm making of it? Is the meaning I'm making sustaining me or is it constraining me? So is that meaning helpful or not? And then if it's not, to challenge the meaning. Is it true? Is there more to this than I am seeing? And oftentimes, so I'm going to share with you exercises to get this. This is just sort of the framework and passage. Then how do we expand our perspective? How do we break those habitual patterns of reacting? Like every time I want to speak, I hold myself back because of that thin story. And what we want to do through expanding our perspective is to get to multiple meanings, multiple insights. What the brain does is it has an experience, and because of previous experiences, it makes meaning immediately and moves us to an habitual reaction or response. Our goal is to actually put a pause in that. And with that pause and challenging the meaning and asking questions of ourselves and playing with it, we move from actually reaction, which is habitual, to response, which is aware and intentional. And that in that pause, there is choice. of how we're making meaning and what we want to do with that meaning. And with choice comes power and agency. And that's the goal. And that's why the pause comes first. And in that pause, it's challenging, it's expanding our perspective, oftentimes a reframing of it, and we'll talk more about that. And within that reframing, we find, what have I learned through this? And how have I grown? How am I different? And where are my strengths in this? So as you remember, the boxes in the hero's journey template, that one box about my inner allies, what do I carry with me? So it's about seeing them, owning them, remembering other stories where in fact I've used them, having the courage to practice using them more, that the next story that we can tie to the thin story is going to just continue to expand that as we continue to grow and heal in our lifetime. So part of that process is also finding compassion and acceptance and gratitude for who we are, for what we've been through in this process. And through that, begin to reinforce the thicker story by stepping into the new stories that we're living in a different way. And that's challenging to step into the old story in new ways as we move forward. Let me just see what's, and so that's also tying that repetitive storyline to thicker alternative story outcomes. Just
Lani, can I ask something here?
Please, let me.
As you're doing all this work with the client, is the client thinking in terms of his or her own, personal experience story, or at what point do you invite the client to create fictional characters?
So there are so many multiple ways of stepping into it. And that is one piece of what I do. So let me share, we come back to the share screen. Let me get the PowerPoint where I want it first. And I'll share with you the various, all right. It's the next one. Here we come back to share screen. So here's some of the story expanders that I use and work with. And there's multiple. I'm sorry, back where we are. So one is to tell the story in third person. And what this does is that when we are in it, oftentimes, especially if we're holding blame and shame in ourselves, we can't get beyond that. If we can move ourselves out of the main character and to a neutral third person, and or have a healing listener reflect back to us a story in third person, that allows the character to hear and see themselves, not as themselves, but as a character out there. And that very process gives some distance, some space to actually hold some compassion for that character that they weren't able to hold earlier. So telling the story also from the perspective of another. And sometimes that can be, I often, if the story, if they're ready and it hasn't been too abusive, is I invite them to tell the story from the perspective of the perpetrator. And so I worked for a long time of stepping in and telling the story as if I were my father. And I got tremendous compassion for the job he was working in, trying to support 4 children. My oldest brother was about to go to a private college, which I knew was very expensive, and my dad was committed to making that happen. Here's Christmas Eve, where I'm expecting all kinds of gifts under the tree. Christmas actually means he doesn't have work for 3 days because of the holiday and won't be paid, and yet he's expected to have all of these goodies. All of the stress he was under. He came right from work to church to meet us there, having not had dinner. We were all fed our hot dogs before. All these things, I started to understand what led him in that moment to just be, that was about him and not about this exuberant 8-year-old. And that also gave me distance. putting it into a fairy tale, what Allison was talking about, is a wonderful way of bringing, as you say, that magical realism into it and getting even more distance and being able to play with it. So I created a fairy tale for myself about being a princess who discovered this loud, beautiful horn, but every time she blew it, a dragon came out of the bushes and put fire on her. And through the journey of my working this fairy tale over and over, what she realized is that the fire breathing dragon came out whether she blew the horn or not, actually. And so she was able to separate the consequence from her behavior and see that fire breathing dragon was stirred up by many things that didn't have to do with the horn or even her. And then to connect to how much joy the horn brought her and how sad she was not to blow it anymore. And then to have the courage to blow it and realize that sometimes the dragon came, but his fire didn't kill her. And sometimes she blew it and the dragon actually praised her. So how, through working it through, how then she goes on tour with her horn, which is me now blowing my horn. So that journey through my fairy tale work brought me to that other place. So that again, the work of taking another perspective of expanding it is very powerful work. Telling the story as if it's happening now is how we claim how different we are from being 8 and who we are now at 63 I am. If this story were to happen to me now, and I envision being in church at 63, and the first realization that comes up is that my dad passed away at 60. I'm older than him. I am now the adult. And in fact, I am far older than the 40-year-old father who was there in that moment with his hand over my mouth. I bring so much more maturity, emotional intelligence, strength, and courage to this moment. So in that moment, I'm singing loudly. He begins his 40-year-old self to put his hand over my mouth, and I have the compassion for him in this moment to take his hand, to hold it, to rather than sink myself, to hold him in a different way, but to keep singing. So it's telling the story, claiming the gifts of who we are now and how we would handle it differently, and allowing that story to shift with claiming those strengths. Alternative outcomes are what I was talking about a little bit earlier of what are other moments when I sang and I didn't get that same feedback. And continually tying that thin story to other stories that went differently. And that's what I did in church that morning when I got thin, as I started to think, wait a minute, my singing is joyful. I'm not hurting anyone right now. My words and teaching have in fact helped people. I may have hurt others, but I think I've helped more than I've hurt. And to stop singing or to stop speaking, to stop teaching, to stop storytelling would not be helpful to me or to others. All of these alternative meanings that I can make out of alternative outcomes and the learning that I've had through this enable me to recover more quickly when I'm caught in a thin story. So a few more things I want to share. I have so much to share and I don't want to keep us from our exercise, but just see where, so this is really tied to resilience, and I want to just make this other piece because it's so important. How do we use this work to be what I call resilient storytellers to ourselves? So resilience comes, and healing, I believe, comes out of the sense that I belong, I'm connected, that I'm competent or capable, and those are the strengths within our story, that I count, my voice matters. This is where Brenda got to realize when she told her story beyond our small group to a larger group, when she had the courage, that's the third part, to do that, she realized that not only is there not shame in her story, but her story can help another. All of these are part of our resilience and our re-strengthening ourselves in our story. And this is that we're continually in this, look, there I am, This is moving from our constraining messages. And we'll think back to disease. I'm disconnected. I'm inadequate. I feel like I can't do it. I'm insignificant. I feel hurt. I feel inferior. That is a broken story. I am still in there. I'm carrying this broken story that's keeping me from connecting to my golden Buddha. And so the sustaining messages that we're trying to get to are, in fact, I belong. I can do it. I am valuable. Just there's nothing I need to do more to be enough. And I can handle what comes. I am hopeful. And if you think back again to the words you all created around disease and healing, these are the words that we're trying to help people get to in that place. So let me just stop share, because there's, I want to come back and just set us up for an exercise and make sure we still have enough time.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes, 27 minutes.
All right. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms of pairs for 10 minutes. And I wanted to share with you an idea. We're not born into a blank slate. We're born into a story. And it's someone else's story. And the context impacts our story, so that right from the day actually we're conceived, because their story impacts us not only in utero, but in our DNA. Their stories of trauma are in their DNA and come to us. If you've heard about generational trauma, it is real and true, and they're doing research on that. Stories continue on for generations through our DNA. And until we do healing within us, we are handing down our trauma stories to future generations. So if you think about what is the story I was born into, in my family, there's a context, there's a geography, there's a time, there's a place, there's a family, there are values, there are true parts that are not equally distributed among all people. So if you think about it like a deck of cards that you're dealt a hand, some people get more aces and some people get more twos. And if you think about it in terms of race, of social economic status, about place, climate, all of those impact our beginning story. And our life is taking that beginning hand of cards, figuring out what we have to hold on to because we're stuck with it, what we can actually discard because when we find the courage to let it go, we can. We're always picking up new cards from the deck that we don't know that are there. Those are our life experiences, some of which we can discard and hold on to. At some point, we are hopefully getting some aces that we want to hold on to that strengthen us. So to think about what is some aces that either you were dealt or that you have picked up through your life experiences that empower you now, that continue to help you win your game of life. What are the aces in your deck and where did they come from? Which ones are you, did you receive at birth from your family of origin that you're proud to hold on to? Which ones have you created through pulling them from the deck and strongly utilizing them? So you'll have in pairs, let's put people in for 8 minutes, Eric, and to make sure each of you get a chance to talk about the aces in your deck. And then we're going to come back and look at what has emerged for you in that process. As you are a story listener for another teller, it is important first to let them be the teller. This is not dialogue, this is story listening. So to give each other at least 2.5 minutes until they are fully silent. And at 1 minute, if they're silent, they're still not done. Let more emerge in that. And then I encourage you to pause, to thank that person without saying anything, to then switch partners so that the other person has a chance to tell their ACE story. And then if there's time at the end, to let each other know what you heard. And that is at that fact listening level, what I heard in your story was, if there's time, how it moved me, how it touched me, what I learned from it. That's as far as we go. So are there any questions?
Well, as is our custom, I'm going to put 3 people in each room because many people have their cameras turned off and those people might be in the kitchen.
All right.
So,
So be
we're saying
thoughtful.
about 8 minutes or 10 minutes?
I'd give them 10 now if there's possibility of 3, and those who have
Yeah.
2 just enjoy more time.
Yeah, so if there's 2, take 5 minutes apiece. If there's 3, take 3 minutes apiece. If you're alone in the room, come back to the main room and we'll meet in the main room. Bye-bye.
Enjoy the storytelling.
Mangalam, hello, how are you? Whoops. Hello. Mangalam, can you hear me?
Yes, Eric, I'm able to hear you. I just joined the meeting.
Okay, and Mary, was there anybody in your room?
There was, but the camera was off and I tried to talk, but
Yes,
no response.
yes. And Donna, are you there? And Joanne, are you there? Donna says no mic, no, no camera. Donna, no mic and no camera. My goodness. Okay. Carol McCormick, hello, how are you? Up, your mic is turned off. Well, why don't we do a modified version of the activity here in the main room? See, the main room is where people come who they don't have partners in their breakout room or people who are just joining the session. So this is sort of the alternative. But okay, the task was to think about metaphorically speaking aces that one has been dealt in life, right?
Yes, and the hands that you were born with. So I think in my DNA, I got, because my father and grandparents were products of the Depression, and my mother too, you know, this really hanging on to money, and you wait to buy something till you have cash, you don't go into debt, and you're not capable. If you're a woman, you have to have a man in your life to protect you and to make the living and so on. And in my life experiences, being a middle child and kind of rebellious, you know, I grew up hearing I could never go into business for myself. My father was a successful entrepreneur. And so I went into business as a storyteller. I mean, I really, you know, gave him the middle finger by not going traditional at all. And I realized that sometimes you pay for something whether you buy it or not. When you need something, you need something. And that, you know, there's a reason for credit cards, and you have to have faith in the, you know, that money will be coming in. It isn't, you know, storytelling has been wonderful for me because it's caused me to rely on hope, and, you know, and not fear shuts down creativity, and be a storyteller, you have to be creative. And so I've had to rely on not material sources for making me feel safe.
And Lani, are you here? Oh my goodness, where's Lani?
I'm here.
Oh, good, good. Okay, Lani, we have 5 minutes.
Oh my goodness.
Continue.
What I would love is to hear what people's experience was, and we can do it in the chat as well. But insight that you had, and it happens in many ways. When you tell a story, you're listening to yourself. When it's in your head, and this is why when we're in isolation and silence with our stories, we get stuck in the thin story because we're just using a small part of our brain. When we speak out loud, the first person who hears it is ourselves, but through a different part of the brain, which gives us more to work with. But to have witnesses to our story is another empowering piece when someone can hold us and hear us, even when we're telling the ACE stories, is a strengthening experience and process. So there are insights that come from both the telling as well as the listening to others and how our stories are similar and different. So it's what I hear as the facts, what I'm moved by hearing myself or another, and how I am changed. And that's the head, the hearts, and the hands, because anytime we hear another story, we are changed by it. It is now in us, and we are learning in us. So I invite you now, anything you learned, anything you felt, any way that you were changed by this experience.
Okay, to speak, please turn your mic on, please speak, and then turn your mic off again.
Use the chat as well.
Yes.
Does anyone want to share?
Yeah.
What happened?
Yes. Can I a big hello to you? I don't know. I mean it's too dark, but all the same. So superb listening to you. I just wanted to share because I'm a life skills counselor. I wanted to sort of share with you what happened just yesterday. A student was having major issues and she wanted to talk to me. And I was wondering, I said, okay, she needed a healing session. So I said, okay, let's do Ho'oponopono, which is a Hawaiian technique of healing. But it went a layer deeper because I thought she needed a healing session. After immediately, I said, okay, now it's over. You put your headphones, now take that off. And she said, no, ma'am, I still need to talk to you further. So there was something which was surging. So, and I'm wondering as to what has happened to this kid. So she says, and I put down the phone. She says, no, I want to talk to you again. So I said, what about? She started howling. She was crying. Now, the thing was that her grandmother was suffering from leukemia. And this is the second time that she's been actually, got the cancerous attack. It's the attack which is basically, which has come back, very virulent. And so she was very saddened and she kept on crying. And one thing what crossed my mind, now my thought process was, are we really making these children ready for death? The same way when you're born, you actually rejoice. I feel death is also a form of rejoicing. But have we prepared? Because students, they cannot take it. And she went on howling. So, listening to you, because what happens, it starts opening your heart as well, because you have questions within you. So thank you so much for today. Really, really enjoyed. And thank you for me. I mean, I've sort of opened up and shared something which had just happened yesterday.
Vandana, thank you for your story. And as you said, we need to be continually gathering, sustaining stories that then help us manage what comes next. Because even if we're born into a hand that has lots of aces, as we continue to live our life, we're going to pick up lots of 2s and 3s of cards in our life experience that challenge us in this. And we need to continue to build the thicker stories that we can retie ourselves to reinflate us when a thin story or a new life experience comes that knocks the wind out of us and deflates us to that place of howling vulnerability. So I'm so glad you could be there for her and listen to her back into her thickness. Beautiful. Anyone else? I see that the chat is very rich. I'm going to be excited to save it and come back and read it. I can't keep up with it, but thank you all for all the ways that you have shared here of yourself and with each other as both tellers, which is always a gift to another when you tell a story, and as listeners, which is equally a gift of courage. Because when we step in as a healing listener, we are opening our own vulnerability, our own self to be present for another in whatever it is they bring, and the responsibility to respond in a way that thickens their story, doesn't make it thinner. So I think that's a good place for us to end, Eric.
Thank you. Yes, yes.
If anyone
Lani
has-
is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just say, if anyone has questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll again put my email in the chat.
And your email ID is also on the presenters page.
Great.
So, well, Lani, I don't know. When you talk, I feel like I'm talking to myself. Why is that?
I want to say that I think it's so powerful when a therapist tells how they made their thin story thick. Because one of my biases against therapists that I have visited is they're so detached sometimes. And when they open their hearts and be more vulnerable, then it helps us, share some of our secrets too, and our, so we don't see them as a perfect evolved, we're all growing together.
We all have a lot of thin stories, and I think the responsibility of doing the work is to be working on them all the time, so we're always growing, but to be willing to share them, to bring hope to others that they too can do the work. It's not to get to a place of healed, but to have the courage to be engaged in healing as a lifetime endeavor.
Great.